Hey, welcome back to another chapter in Mastering Swift tutorial. This is Vedat from Programmership. In this chapter, we are gonna talk about optional in Swift. When we define a variable in Swift, it is non-optional by default, which means the variable must contain a valid non-nil value. If we try to define nil value, it will give an error. For example, let's define a string variable and then try to update its value as nil. Let's say var my name is equal to, let's say, Mariam. And if I try to update its value as nil, let's hit run. As you can see, guys, when we try to give a nil value to my name, it gives an error. In the other programming languages, nil is a pointer to a non-existing object, but in Swift, nil means the absence of a value. When we set an optional variable value as nil, it will indicate the absence of a value. It is pretty interesting. Another benefit, when we define a variable as an optional type, we don't have to specify its initial value. So let's define some variables as optional and see how it works. Let's define my name as optional. First, put your colon and specify its data type, which is string, and to represent the my name as optional string, just put a question mark at the end of your data type, just like that. So there is another version of defining an optional. Let's do that for another variable. Let's say my surname, it will be optional within the string type. So these two definitions are the same. Let's define another variable which is int optional. Let's say var my age, put a colon and say int, put your question mark to represent it as optional. These variables can have a valid value or no value just because they are defined as optional types. Let's give a value for my name, say Vedat, or we can define it as nil. Let's try to change it as nil and hit run. You can see there is no error for that. It also applies for another types. Let's define my age as nil. Okay, in fact, the optional type in Swift is an enum that has two possible members, none and some. Let's go to the source code of optional and see what we have. So here, just press Command key, hit optional, and here we can see jump to definition. When we click, we can see the optional is actually an enum which has two members, none and some. The wrapped here is the generic type that associates with the data types such as string, integer, etc. When we set nil value to an optional variable, it will have the value of none, which is this guy. Or if you define a valid value, then it will have the value of some, just like that. There is also another important thing about optional. When we define a variable or an object as optional, it is wrapped by the Swift compiler. We can think of it as covering something. Compiler thinks that thing can be none or a valid value. So to access the value of that thing in our code, we must unwrap it before using. Otherwise, the compiler couldn't know whether our optional object or variable has a valid value. If you have no reason to create an object or a variable with an initial value, or there is no possibilities that your object or variable could be nil, then it is better to use non-optional type, which Swift provides in default. But if there is a reason that I just said, then you can use the optional type. But don't forget to unwrap your optional object before accessing its value. Well, what is unwrapping an optional type? There are few approaches to unwrap an optional. Let's get back to our playground. So these are forced, unwrapping. The second one is optional, binding. The third one is unwrapping with nil, coalescing operator, and the other one is optional chaining. So it is better to explain optional chaining in the chapter of class and structure. For this chapter, let's get into detail one by one for the first three approaches. So let's start with forced unwrapping. When we define an object or a variable in optional type, we can unwrap it with an exclamation mark. This is called forced unwrapping. As using forced unwrapping, we tell the Swift compiler that this optional object definitely has a valid non-nil value, and compiler thinks we know what we are doing, so there won't be any alert info. It is dangerous if you are not sure that your optional object always has a valid value rather than nil value. It may cause runtime errors if the object has a nil value. Let's see the forced unwrapping in an example. Let's say var, again, my name is string optional. Let's say my name is equal to the dot. So let's try to print the my name and see what we have. Hit run, and here we can see it prints the dot, but within the optional statement. So why? Because we didn't unwrap the my name optional. If we unwrap it with forced unwrapping, just put the exclamation mark at the end of your variable, optional variable. Let's try to run the print again, and here we can see there is no more optional statement, just the value of my name, which is the dot. So if I define my name as nil and try to unwrap it with forced unwrapping, let's see what happens. Hit run, and here it gives an error, just because here we try to unwrap a nil, which is none. We can get rid of the error by adding an if statement before using forced unwrap. In the if statement, we will check whether my name is nil or not. So here, let's say if my name is not nil, then forced unwrap the my name and print it. When we hit run, there's no more error. If we give a valid value, let's say George, and hit run, the my name is not nil, so the if statement will be executed and we unwrapped the my name and print it out, which is George. But this is not the best practice for unwrapping an optional. There is also another approach called optional binding, which is better and more useful. It is also recommended by the other developers. So let's look at optional binding. Let's delete this. In optional binding, we check the optional object or variable whether it has a valid or nil value. If it has a valid value, then we unwrap it into a constant or a variable. This is all done in one step. Let me show you the skeleton of the optional binding format. We are starting with if, and here if you want to unwrap your optional into a constant, say let. If you want it to be a variable, so you can start with var, it's all right, but I want to go on with let, if let, and put your unwrapped constant name, say unwrapped name equal your optional variable, open your curly bracket and close it. Here inside the if let, we can use unwrapped name constant, which is our unwrapped optional. So let's make an example and see how it works. Delete this and say var my message. It will be string optional, and I want to define a string for that my message. Let's say hello world, and here let's make optional binding. If I want to unwrap it into a constant, for that let's put let keyword, and let's say my message 2 is equal to our optional, which is my message, and open your curly bracket and close it. Here I want to print the my message 2, which is unwrapped constant. Hit run, and here we can see hello world without any optional statement. We can also use the same name of the optional variable within the optional binding statement. That is absolutely all right. I mean, instead of defining a new name, we can just use the same name with the optional. It's all right. Let's delete this too and hit run. Here we can see hello world again. So it is also a good practice to use the same name. We don't have to find another name. So here in if let, we can also control if my message optional is nil with the else statement. Print my message is nil. So let's define my message optional variable as nil and see if the else statement will be executed. Hit run. Here we can see the else statement was executed and my message is nil was printed out. Let me explain this statement one more time again. We just defined an optional string variable called my message and set a value. If my message is nil, then the else statement will work. If this is not nil, then my message optional will be unwrapped into this, which is the same name, my message constant. And then inside the if statement, we can access the unwrapped constant. It is also possible to unwrap multiple optional variables in a single optional binding line. Just separate it with commas. Let's see that. Delete this line and create a new variable. Say my message 2. It will also be string optional. Let's define some value for these variables. My message is equal to to hello, my message to is equal to world. Let's put a space. So we already unwrapped the my message optional in this if-let statement. So let's try to unwrap the my message to in the same line. To do that, put a comma here. Let's say let's my message to is equal to my message 2. And we can also print the my message 2 as well. Let's hit run and see the result. Here we can see hello and world within unwrapped format. Please pay attention. If one of the optional variables is nil, the whole optional binding statement will fail and the else statement will work. Let's try to set my message to as nil and hit run again. As we can see, the else statement was executed. So what about unwrapping with nil coalescing operator? In this approach, we can set a default value if the target optional variable is nil. We are gonna use double question mark to define a default value for unwrapping optional. Let's make an example and see what I mean. Let's delete all this and create a new optional var my book, and let's define it as string optional. So here let's create another variable my book 2 is equal to, let's try to unwrap it with the nil coalescing operator. To do that, put your optional and then put double question mark, and here after the double question mark we are going to define our default string, default book. Let's print the my book and see the result. Let's print the my book 2 and see the result. Hit run. Here we can see default book was defined into the my book 2. Why? Because we didn't specify any value for my book. Hence, the default string was assigned into this variable. So let's give a value for my book. Let's say mastering Swift. And if I try to run the print statement again, here we can see my book is now has the mastering Swift value, which is unwrapped version of my book optional. Well, I think that's enough talking about optional in this chapter. We are gonna use it in our code maybe hundreds of times. See you in the next one. Goodbye.